Hi, welcome to Notions of Progress, the show that examines ideas of progress in the context of history from antiquity to the present. Today, we are very fortunate to have as our guest Professor Tyson Retz, an intellectual historian at the University of Stavanger in Norway. We're going to discuss mostly ideas from his 2022 book, Progress in the Scale of History, which offers an important contribution to better understand the role of history in informing our view of progress. In this work, Professor Retz outlines 5 categories of progress that provides a very insightful framework servicing distinct conceptions of progress dating back to antiquity. Furthermore, he fundamentally questions how scale, contingency, and other multiple dimensions impact our understanding of progress. So with that, let me introduce Professor Retz, and we'll bring him on to the show. Hi, Professor Retz. Welcome.
Hello, Marshall. Pleased to be with you, and thank you for the invitation.
No, thank you for coming on. I just want to start off before we say to say that I really enjoyed your book, and I wanted to take a comment to say that, it really struck the right balance for me as somebody who's a researcher at the proper level of academic rigor, but at the same time was very accessible. And the reading was, for me, this was very important to try to strike this balance and understand how these ideas can be relatable to non-academics as well, but most importantly, it contains the strong academic rigor that's required to, approach this serious subject. And I found it to be extremely compelling, as well as the stories that came out from this book I thought were incredible. Anyway, so let's kind of before we start to go into kind of scaffold some of the key pieces before we go into the sections of the book, maybe we can just talk a little bit generally. I picked one of the bunch of quotes out to kind of throw back at you during this discussion today, but one of the comments that really struck me early on is when you kind of talked about the idea of potentially that ideas of progress had become out of fashion. I think, the exact phrase that you gave was something along the lines that it was essentially heading towards, some kind of a version of people weren't using it anymore, but yet the possibility now that it was being revised. So I was curious if you would kind of just talk a little bit about that. Has there been if you would talk about, maybe some of the reasons behind that?
Yeah, I was struck by a paradox very early on in that the progressive left were often the least inclined to believe in the idea of progress. That is, those who subscribe to a progressive political agenda. I'll situate myself within that political standpoint. They were skeptical about the idea of progress. So it became very clear to me early on that there seemed to be an important distinction to make between being progressive as an adjective that qualifies a particular attitude or program and a subscription to a larger concept, the noun, that is progress. Progress seemed to be mistrusted as some sort of unfortunate legacy of the Enlightenment, but one may nevertheless label themselves progressive politically, or we also have something called progressive education. And that's something I've been looking at more recently. So that there was a tension there that needed to be explored. And I think that was my gateway into the part of the book that you're referring to, where I'm addressing myself to those who see the benefit of belief in progress, what it has to offer us, but were nevertheless skeptical at the same time.
And that's fantastic, Professor. And I think that you also touched just there, and you mentioned it in the book as well. Is it just a question of linguistics? Is this a question of it being progress as a noun, as a destination, versus the idea of progress as a verb, the idea of progress in progressivism? And I think that it's the former that, if I understand what you're saying, is essentially was the issue.
Yeah, certainly my conversations and wider reading is that very few are willing to give up on the idea of there being positive change, but that the concept or the idea of progress was not to be bought into in the same way that previous generations might have. I wouldn't say it's a lexical or linguistic distinction. I think it's a conceptual one, and I think the concepts carry very different meanings, which are carried down and recycled and transformed through history. My work in intellectual history and conceptual history, I would say with this book more specifically, is very much about the changing, transformation, recycling of different meanings within concepts that seem to nevertheless have some sort of stable meaning that we can ascribe to them. And progress is certainly one of those. We might get to that later, I think, once we start talking about progress as a collective singular, as a concept that aggregates and blends together a variety of different concepts and meanings.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I just to kind of throw one more comment in this, you know, when I was going through your work and I was going back to some of the source material as well, I think it was Sorel who said something along the lines of that his issue was not with progress, but it was with the idea of progress, which was interesting as well. This was really about how progress was conceived and conceptualized versus the idea of progress as a general concept, which I thought was particularly interesting. So in this context, maybe we can talk about, you know, do you think that the role of secularism had a big role here in changing how people thought about progress? And we'll go into the specifics of kind of like the scaffolding of your book in a second, but I just wanted to kind of put that past as well, like some of the attributes or the dimensions that influence this different conceptualization of progress. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
It might have been credible to say several decades ago that progress was an 18th and 19th century substitute for religion, but I'm not sure that argument would carry today. Look, it's sometimes referred to as a kind of a secular belief in something that was divinely given according to a Christian or metaphysics, I suppose, or teleology before the mid-18th century. But I don't necessarily, I wouldn't put secularism front and center in my historical explanation of the rise of progress in the mid-18th century. I do believe that it is coeval, roughly, with the rise of secularism, but I'm not putting that at the heart of my explanation for how it comes about. But definitely the idea that progress offers a kind of movement, a kind of what I refer to as absolute progress, as a kind of movement through history to something better, is definitely an idea that gains currency with the rise of secularism in Europe and the wider Western Hemisphere. During that century that we do refer to as the century of secularization, and that is the 19th century, I am quite clear in my book that I do think that some of the core ideas about progress in the 19th century are legacies of 18th century Enlightenment thinking. I think the 18th century is where the action is when it comes to the emergence of the idea of progress. And that's why I suppose it predates, I suppose, the 19th century, which we see as the century of secularism par excellence. So it's certainly there, it's certainly a factor,
Right.
but not necessarily, not giving it the causal force that
Understood. And I mentioned it more of as an aside, and absolutely, I'm certainly not looking to categorize your work within the role of as being all defining in that way. And I would love to, as we kind of walk through kind of like the path and the way that you've organized your book, maybe we can discuss it again as we get to that section, as we discuss the various categories of progress. Professor, do you think before we get started going through the various sections, beginning with no progress, because I really would love to start there. Could we talk a little bit about scale and the role of scale and other factors that you thought, in your book that you thought had a profound effect on the ways we conceptualize progress?
No, absolutely. So the book is a product of a hunch, I suppose I had that, and I tested that hunch in the writing of the book, and that was that the sample size, let's call it the sample size instead of scale to start with, so that sample size one works with is going to shape largely the kind of claims that one can make about progress. For instance, if I draw from a 10 or 20 year period of history and take that as the basis for my claim that we should expect more of that in the future, it's going to be quite different type of claim about the connection between past, present and future than had I taken my sample size from 2,000 or 3,000 years. So that's a temporal point, but you could also say the same about spatial, whether I'm referring to my local community in the past 10 or 20 years or things that have happened in the United States or globally, whatever. The choice regarding the sample size seems to be a determining factor. That's not merely to point at the relativity of progress. I think the more profound point there is that progress carries a philosophy of history in tow. It is animated by a philosophy of history, and that is one that comes about in the mid-18th century that makes certain connections between the past, present, and future, which, of course, comes about with the emergence of a more fully fledged historical consciousness as well. So I'm saying that progress is fundamentally a historical argument, or progress is an idea that comes about in historical thinking, and the scale on which we conduct that historical inquiry will play a large role in the kinds of claims we make about progress now and into the future.
And do you think that some of the kind of pioneers regarding academics who thought about progress, people such as Bury, for example, do you think that these were ideas that they refuted, or that they just didn't conceptualize at the time? Or do you think that there's some alignment here with those ideas, but they were focused on something separate? And then maybe we can dig into the different categorizations of progress.
That's an excellent question. I think Bury is interesting in the sense that he certainly saw progress as movement. Now, movement towards a telos, regrettably, might be the grounds on which he is most meaningfully criticized, but certainly progress to him was movement, which certainly is something that comes about in conjunction with historical consciousness or historical thinking at a particular moment in European history. That can be problematic, that argument, and I've encountered this before. Once you start to connect the idea of progress with a particular moment of European history, are you by implication saying that, well, the rest of the world didn't believe in progress and didn't have progress, and you can run into all sorts of issues there. But it does force one to think very clearly about the nature of the movement that is implied by progress. Other books, other classics, Robert Nesbitt's book, a fantastic book. However, I think he's referring to something called developmental improvement a lot of the time, and that seems to me to be uncontroversial. We can talk more about developmental improvement when we come to Antiquity, hopefully.
Yeah, and I would like to go into it, but while if we could just take a minute, Professor, because you raised, I think, many really important points, maybe just kind of like a little bit of a historiographical kind of discussion, very briefly, what was the tension that Professor Bury brought up that was then later refuted or argued against with Professor Edelstein, and then further maybe clarified with Dodd? I just, not to get too far into the weeds in this type of discussion, but I think it's important to just understand what the argumentation was. Why, as we're going to talk about antiquities next in the first category, what was primarily Bury's argument about why progress didn't exist, and what was Edelstein's primary answer to that question?
The controversy was about the extent to which the ancients believed or did not believe in progress. That's really what it came down to. And Bury, in his analysis, excluded the ancients from belief in the idea of progress. Now, that was unacceptable to a number of 20th century scholars who looked at Greek sources and thought, well, no, there's a clear celebration of advancement and of improvement in these sources. And they argued for an ancient belief in the idea of progress, some by sort of being more forgiving, I suppose, with the concepts that the Greeks used, and saying, okay, it might not be the right word, but implied in this word is something very similar. And others said, well, okay, there was a nice book by Sue Blundell that said that, Bury might have defined it in terms of movement from past, present, and future, but that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. You can have a concept of progress without referring to the future at all. So you could shift that very influential definition by Bury and thereby include the ancients within that concept.
And on that note, Professor, would you say that it was fair to say that if Bury was sitting here now, that he would argue, and I believe that he has argued, that he didn't feel that the Greeks had, he didn't feel that the Greeks had a concept of the future, that they were kind of like bound to their own myths during their time, which you talked about, cyclical myths or myths of a great decline, which we'll go into a little bit. But his argument essentially would be like, well, you can't have an idea of progress without an idea of the future. So he was making a attempt. Would that be a fair categorization, or am I oversimplifying?
No. I think think that's fair. I think they did think about the future, but it was pessimistic. I mean, Aristotle, I think, summed up the ancient view when he said, well, sure, we can make all of these advances, but there will be a catastrophe and they will have to be rediscovered. So whether that's linear development along progressive lines, and then a catastrophe that undoes all that advancement, you kind of have to start again from the start of that linear trajectory. Or if that's something more like a cyclical view, maybe that's beside the point. But certainly progress to Aristotle is difficult, I think, because of the need to constantly rediscover previous discoveries.
So maybe we can now start and kind of discuss the first category that you did, because I'd like to, within there, I'd like to just pick out one or two examples that I thought, again, that you really laid out carefully and very interestingly, but at the same time, that seemed like almost they're contradictions to even Bury's conception as expressed by himself. But anyway, I really don't want to turn this into a historiographical discussion only. I really want to more talk about the substance of your book.
No.
So maybe we can start. Can you lay out we could talk, just lay out the first category of the 5 categories of this book, and kind of just talk about the implications and the conclusions that we should draw from that first category of no progress?
So I should be clear that the categories are periodizations in some sense. I didn't merely want to try and recount the history, the 2,000-year history of progress. It's a short book, we should mention, in 70 or 80 pages.
Right.
So I wanted to find a way to do this in 5 neat chapters. So the categories are also periodizations or even
Sure.
prolongations to some extent. And the first category, no progress, is about the ancient world, and it's about the way in which the conception of history in the ancient world did not lend itself to belief in progress. My key point in that chapter is to distinguish progress from what I've just termed developmental improvement, and that is to say that there are widespread instances of scientists, astronomers celebrating advances in technical knowledge and what we today call scientific knowledge, but that they were confined to that domain. They were confined to that scientific domain. So there was improvement, cumulative improvement, ongoing cumulative improvement. Just like today, we would say that the iPhone 5 is an improvement on the iPhone 4. Seems uncontroversial to say so. Might come about with a whole bunch of other problems, but that's getting to another topic once we start talking about problem solving. But it's merely to say that, yes, it seems uncontroversial to say that there are improvements in technique, but I'm not one to consider that as evidence of a belief in progress. The difference when you come around to absolute progress, the next category,
Okay.
is that these advances in different domains of human endeavor are put together in what Reinhard Koselleck calls a collective singular. That is to say, scientific advancement can now be considered human advancement. Scientific progress can be considered human or even moral progress. And this is something that belongs to the second half of the 18th century, where you have a range of treatises written mostly by Frenchmen who are blurring the boundaries between these advances in different domains. So the question here, the analytical problem here, is the extent to which advances in specific domains, called domain specificity, lends itself to wider claims about human or moral progress. And you see this even today. You see, it's techno-optimists, you see this a lot among them, where progress is just shorthand for talking about the potential for technological or scientific advancement to solve some of our more pressing moral and ethical existential issues. So that blurring of domain specificity remains an element of the idea of progress, and it's one that really comes about in the late 19th century. My next category is very much a feature of the second half of the 19th century, relative progress.
Professor, before we go on, could I just touch on one quick point, if it's okay?
Of course.
So I by the way, I really love, and this really came out in the book, how I understand the periodization, but you draw this through line, or it's implied this through line, that it brings out the relevancy of those ideas today in a very modern context, and it takes it right back to examining somehow some of those similar tensions existed during antiquity at a time, and then as it moves through the period, even though under different contexts, which I think is, again, for me, an idea I'm really trying to kind of lean into and flesh out, the idea that there's a bit of a universal quality of these ideas just in the fact that they show rhymes of themselves throughout time, and I think that comes through in the book very much. And just in the example you gave is super helpful. And before we move on to the relative progress, I just wanted to just ask one more question. Do you think that that there were, kind of broad exceptions that maybe hinted towards, let's say, the absolute progress, i.e., the Sophists? The Sophists had some notion of human agency as a driver of history and progress. Do you think that in some way, shape, or form they were kind of like a forerunner, even though in a very limited way, of what would then become later an Enlightenment idea? Or is that making a link that's not there?
No, I certainly think it's important work to be done. It would be to look at particular philosophical schools, both in the Greek and Roman worlds, or even early Christianity, that might contradict what I've just said. Well, they would do that by, as you've said, by showcasing the belief in human agency to create a future that was better, but also a lasting better. It can't be, I don't think it's going to stand up as progress if the advancement that is created by human toil and endeavor is going to be lost due to some cyclical view of history. So I think a more underlying concept of history and of the connection between past, present, and future might counteract some of those, but it certainly would be an interesting exploration. Yes. Yeah.
And also another kind of like dimension that you mentioned, early on, going back to antiquity regarding this notion of pessimism, which again many solid arguments could be made that as an overall categorization has a lot of relevancy. Would you say that the response to that in absolute progress was a form of optimism? Was that a factor in the ideas of Condorcet and Kant and Hegel and Marx in bringing forward kind of like a new vision of progress, or their own vision of progress?
Definitely. Optimism and pessimism is something. There's one point I forgot to make from your previous question that
Please.
I think is important, though. When you talked about the Sophists and other philosophical schools, I end that chapter with it's very short, but quick discussion of the difference between vertical and horizontal frames, in that for much of the ancient world, we could look at the extent to which this is true in different philosophical schools, but that the better life was available vertically. It's transcendental, so it's there, it's available to you right now. Everything you need for a better life is available to you transcendentally. It's out there. You just need to tap into it vertically. There's no striving in the present, besides maybe looking up to the sky and trying to tap into what's transcendental. There's no toil or effort with some sort of future reward that you need to engage in. So there's a verticality in the ancient world that is something quite different in terms of how it frames the rewards of human action compared with what comes later in the Enlightenment. You've talked about the Enlightenment and optimism. It would be definitely oversimplifying things to say that the Enlightenment was optimistic, because of course the 18th century is also a time of great pessimism and belief that European civilization was about to suffer the same fate as Rome. The 18th century is rife with fears of degeneration in morality and in ethics and society as a whole. However, the prophets of progress, the great system builders, did believe, and this is what I mean by absolute progress and universal history being the scale on which absolute progress is visible, is that hidden plan of nature. The hidden plan of nature. If humankind I should say, can discover that hidden plan of nature, then we will move forward as one observes in nature getting on with its business, that humans in nature will be able to realize the same sort of endless and unlimited future potential.
And phenomenal, Professor. And as we move on to the relative progress, as you said, one last piece. When you talk about, or when the other academics as well talk about universal history in that time, could you give a brief, one sentence understanding of how one might think about universal history and its introduction during that time? What was the profound difference between this way of conceptualizing progress and conceptualizing history?
Well, universal history is another way of saying philosophical history or armchair speculation. It precedes what Leopold von Ranke did in the 19th century, where he got appealed for historians to go do archival research. So it's pre-archival. It belongs to a time when history was still very much a form of belles lettres. It was a form of, it was uncontroversial that history was literary, but it was also a form of philosophy, and it was a priori, before experience. Now, with universal history, I mean, the term universal history implies that they tried to take it all in. It wasn't necessarily concerned with the specifics of a particular historical context, as comes later, but it's concerned with taking in the whole of human experience. Didn't really have much faith in human beings at the particular level. He said that if you zoom down and look at humans on the level of the particular, you're going to be disappointed in human beings. But if you zoom out and abstract and look at the big picture, the big scale, then you do see human action moving in the direction of creating a society, a constitution in which human potential may fully realize itself. Now, universal history is far more than the one sentence you asked for, but it's a big question. Universal history, you always have to, there's also stadial history. Now, stadial history is also central to the emergence of the idea of progress in the 18th century, and that is simply the idea that history succeeds through a series of stages, the last of which is the commercial society, that celebrated by Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations, which is the consummate celebration of the commercial, of Homo economicus, I suppose, of the commercial society, and the commercial society being that in which the individual human being is able to realize their fullest potential.
And as another dimension to that, before we move on to relative progress, you also mentioned, or kind of briefly touched on, this notion of the driver of history. Do you think that in this context of progress that there was an implication that there was a deterministic component of universal history, meaning that things were moving towards a specified past? Or did this new human agency, which came about during this time, create an open book with no limits and no direction?
I talk in the book about some French naturalists. De Buffon is important here in the way that he reconfigures an early modern notion of preformation, which comes from Leibniz. So before these naturalists, say 1760s, 1770s, preformation is hugely important, structuring the concept of time, and it presents history as an unfolding from a seed that is effectively pre-coded, it's preset. So the seed has all of nature's plan already coded within it, we would say today, and then history is simply the unfolding of that pre-given, predetermined plan, deterministic. But his discoveries are that no, the seed can be engineered so that it unfolds according not to nature's plan, but according to our own preferences and intentions as not just individuals, but as collective agents. And there seems like a cliche to say that, but that's a fundamental shift in how human action is conceived and the possibilities for human action having desirable outcomes.
And as you kind of touched on very briefly before, this sounds a little bit like Aristotle in this notion of where he believed that there was some kind of a natural form, that while you said that one could progress towards its end, that there was some kind of a preconceived notion, that there was an operating system there to a certain extent.
Yeah.
That's kind of how, which is an interesting contrast as well. Professor, now, and I want to be conscious of your time, respectful of your time, because you've really been. I really appreciate you. We kind of darting in and out of these different rabbit holes here. Let's move on to relative progress. And when you go through this, I also just want to point out before you go that some of the histories and the stories that you told in this particular chapter of the book were, to me, especially about the Japanese, first time that I've ever come across some of these perspectives, which I thought were absolutely spectacular. Maybe now, just kind of with that in mind as an aside, could you kind of talk about the conception of relative progress and then maybe touch a little bit about the importance of the Japanese and the Indian perspective as well? Thank you for listening to part 1 of our interview with Professor Retz. In this first segment, Professor Retz provided a fascinating overview of his framework for understanding progress. Beginning with the conception of no progress during Antiquity, he guided us straight on through to the emergence of absolute progress in the Enlightenment. In part 2, we'll continue our conversation by examining relative progress before moving into the more contemporary categories of everybody's progress and finally anti-progress. Thanks for listening to part 1 of this conversation. Join us next time as we continue with Professor Tyson Retz on notions of progress.